Good morning, everyone. Very, very warmly welcome to the second edition of the Incorporate Sustainability Conference, to our second day, actually. It's with great pleasure that I say that we're going to be speaking about competition law and sustainability today, a long-awaited topic. Two fields that are seemingly unrelated, but once we relate them to the regenerative practices of sustainability and circular economy, we see that they have much in common. Since I'm not an expert on the field, but rather an enthusiastic academic trying to work on it, today will be opened by Simon Holmes from the University of Oxford, who is also a member of the UK Competition Appeal Tribunal in London. He's a visiting professor as well as judge. He has extensive experience in the field. He's based in London. He also legally advises to the NGO client earth. He's a strategic advisor to sustainable public affairs in Brussels, a member of the Competition Commission of the International Chamber of Commerce, a member of the International Advisory Board of the LDC, an associate member of the UCL Center for Law. Until the UK left the EU, he was actually also a non-governmental advisor to the European Commission from the International Competition Network. He advised on competition law for some 35 years, actually, before joining the CAT. He was laterally head of competition at the S.J. Berwin and then King & Wood Melsons, first in the UK and Europe, and then on a global basis. He currently teaches competition law at Oxford University and is a regular writer, speaker, and chair on competition law and regulatory matters at conferences and seminars. He has a particular interest in competition law, climate change, and sustainability, and is writing and speaking about it on a regular basis. So thank you very much, Simon, for being with us today. And I'm very much looking forward to hear your opening speech. So if you're ready, you can go. The floor is all yours.
Thanks, Leila. After that long introduction, I really think of myself still as a private practitioner, having spent most of my career doing that. And that's where I want to start, really. As a private practitioner advising on competition law, towards the end, I felt an increasing tension between my role as a competition lawyer, and that is its association with competition law and the process of competition, which often leads to a sort of race to the bottom, pushing everything to everybody to produce and consume more and more products, often without real regard to the consequences for the climate, our environment, and indeed society as a whole. So the tension between competition law and my increasing concerns, everybody's increasing concerns about the climate crisis. So I spent much of the last 2 years thinking, speaking, and writing about how competition law can be taken in house, or rather how sustainability concerns, climate change, can be factored into our practical application of competition law. When I first started looking at this, there seemed to be very little out there on this, very little written on it, with a few exceptions. And now I'm pleased to say, I think I can say it's one of the two hottest issues in competition law and antitrust today in the world. The rival, of course, being the concerns over the digital platforms. And I have some friendly rivalry with colleagues who focus on the digital agenda, saying that that's yesterday's issue. Climate change is today's issue. Well, there is some truth in that, but it is clearly high on the agenda of everybody. High on the agenda of the national competition authorities, and I won't go into what they're doing on it, because I think my colleague Martin Gassler will be speaking to that in a moment. But I'm pleased to say industry is getting more and more focused on this issue. I had the privilege of chairing a working group for the International Chamber of Commerce who wrote a paper on it. Major companies like Unilever and many others, but I mention Unilever because they've been particularly engaged in this and put forward some excellent contributions to the European Commission with practical examples of the interaction between competition law and sustainability. And international bodies are also now focused on it, from the ICN and the OECD. The OECD had a roundtable on sustainability and competition law, which I was able to speak before Christmas. And of course, the European Commission. I think others will probably say more about that, but I'll just since I'm introducing, say that back in 2019, we invited Commissioner Vestager to speak on this, and I think it was the first time she'd really spoken on it. Since then, the Commission has had consultations on competition policy supporting the Green Deal and is now looking to reform its so-called horizontal guidelines, which we now know will factor in sustainability. Again, I think others will say more about that. But just before I move on, I should say that not everything is going in our direction. You never underestimate the extent of opposition. What I say is the antitrust to competition establishment is very conservative, and there are strong conservative forces out there, backed by what I see as a somewhat myopic neoliberalistic Chicago School of Economics. And I'm putting that very crudely, but just to give you a flavor of where the opposition is largely coming from. Sustainability in competition law is relevant to all areas of competition law. I just wanted to flag these because we all tend to focus on the first one, and I'm the one who focuses perhaps more than anybody else on the first one. The first area of competition law is when businesses look to cooperate to fight climate change, to promote sustainability, they get nervous about competition law. So I'm talking about the Article 101 prohibition on anti-competitive agreements and their national equivalents. We'll come back to that. And then there's the abuse of dominance provisions. Perhaps the abuse of dominance provisions in Article 102 of the treaty could be used sometimes to attack unfair practices. For example, the grotesquely low wages that are often paid to people in supply chains. That doesn't seem fair. Is it an abuse of a dominant position? And sometimes I think sustainability could be a legitimate, I use the term loosely, defense to accusations that a company is abusing its dominant position. If I say as a dominant company, I will supply A because they're going to make sustainable use of my products. They're going to recycle them and not dump them in a river. Somebody else is going to just chuck them in the sea. And I say, no, I'm not supplying the person who's going to do those bad things. I don't see that should be seen as discrimination or a refusal to supply. And then mergers. Now, I don't want to overstate this, but in my work, I've suggested there are 5 ways in which sustainability, climate change might be factored into merger analysis, either as a factor supporting the clearance of a deal, or exceptionally, I accept, as a factor saying that a deal should not be allowed or should only be allowed subject to remedies. Now, all 3 of those areas I've covered extensively in my papers, and in the Annex 1 to these slides, you'll see a list of some of the papers in which I discuss this. But I just want to mention 2 other areas which I haven't personally really discussed, and that is state aid and public procurement. State aid, because to fight climate change, we need massive injections of public money. Much of that would constitute state aid requiring approval by the authorities. The European Commission's estimated that they need some 260 billion euros of extra investment between 2020 and 2030 to support the Green Deal. Now, it's essential that is not channeled into supporting fossil fuels, and it's essential that it is used to promote things like renewable energy and so forth. So that's an area, a very important area it's the poor relation of competition law. Actually, the real poor relation is public procurement, which is often not recognized as part of competition law. And most competition lawyers, myself included, know very little about it. But if we could use the public purse, the public spending wisely to promote sustainability, to help fight climate change, it has a massive potential to transform the way we do things. The IMF estimated that the public spending was some $13 trillion a year. Now, I'm sure that figure is out of date because that was pre the pandemic. Now, I haven't written on these last 2 topics, but the book, which I had the privilege of editing, has 2 articles on each of these, which I would commend to people. So, why are we so concerned about this? What's competition law really got to do with why should we be thinking about climate change and competition law at the same time? Well, the answer is quite simple. We have an existential crisis, and I don't think that's an exaggeration. And to use an English expression, we need all hands to the pump, which means we need to use all legal and policy tools which we have. And as Commissioner Vestager has said, everyone is called upon to make our contribution to the necessary change, including competition enforcers. And I would add, including business and in fact, everybody. Now, people will say, well, shouldn't this be done by regulation? Of course, we can use regulation, but regulation is often too slow, too narrow in its scope, limited to particular jurisdictions, or frankly, simply not ambitious enough. And business and others are prepared to go further and faster. Then you say, well, can't businesses do it unilaterally? Well, yes, they can often, and they should where they can. They can compete on sustainability. My products are more sustainable than your products. Come and buy my products. But that's great if sufficient customers are prepared to buy them so that that's profitable. But frankly, often they will suffer what we call a first mover disadvantage. Sometimes there are short-term costs, usually short-term costs, to making something more sustainably, which may not, if you can't recoup that, you suffer a competitive disadvantage. And even if you can produce a few nice products on a sustainable, profitable basis, often it's too limited and it's not done, you can't do it fast enough or at the scale that is necessary for the transformation which we need, which means businesses need to cooperate and work together to transform how they do things in their part of society, in their business area. But then people get nervous. I can't speak, they've been told for so long, quite rightly, they can't speak to their competitors about this and that and the other. So they get nervous. So it's the fear of competition law really is where competition law comes into this. And I've set out in, I think it's Annex 2 to my slides, some examples from my own experience. And that's just the tip of the iceberg, from things like efforts to try and improve recycling, to reduce the use of single-use plastic, to deal with concerns of deforestation, soybean supply, fishing quotas, all sorts of things where people have said, we'd like to do this, but we're frightened of competition law. That's why competition law is so relevant here. And I would just emphasize before somebody raises it in a question, we're not talking about greenwashing. If people collaborate to restrict how they compete on environmental criteria, well, they should be hit in all the usual ways, big fines, whatever, by competition law. And if people get together for a legitimate reason and then start talking about illegitimate things, well, then again, competition law applies. But that's no different to meeting in a trade association or going to a bar for a drink and then talking about things you shouldn't talk about. And I do think there is greenwashing out there, but it's not a competition law problem, it's greenwashing. The greenwashing, in my experience, is consumer law issues, which the competition authorities, where they have a consumer role, are busy fighting, people making wrong, false sustainability claims. And what I've emphasized in my work is that we have the legal tools already. We're not talking about changing the law fundamentally. We have the tools in both, and I'm focused particularly on EU law here, in the constitutional provisions of the treaties and in the actual competition provisions themselves. And I'm increasingly focused actually on the actual competition provisions. Again, in my work, I've analysed the constitutional provisions, and I don't intend to go into them. They're mentioned in my slides. I will just read one of them, though, to you, and that's Article 11, just to give you a flavour. This is Article 11 of the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union. This says environmental protection requirements must, that's my emphasis, although there is legal basis for the emphasis, which I won't go into, must be integrated into the definition and interpretation of union policies and activities, in particular with a view to promoting sustainable development. So in other words, I am focusing on the law, not what I see as rather abstract concepts like consumer welfare, public interest, non-economic factors, non-competition factors, all things you'll hear people writing about endlessly in academic papers. Whether those are useful or not useful terms is interesting, but not really my main concern. Whatever they are not the right starting point for any analysis. You have to start with what the law actually says. So what I've been saying is, let's not sit around discussing these funny concepts. Last, the world heats up, last we have floods, last we have forest fires and so on. Let's get on and actually look at what the law says and apply it in a practical way to real life situations. That cartoon was meant to illustrate my feelings on this. I had this mental picture of, you know the story of the Emperor Nero supposed to be playing his violin whilst Rome burnt. And that's how I feel that some of the competition community is doing. It's sitting around debating these things whilst climate change runs on at a high pace. So I set out in my papers, my original paper on this, 5 ways in which I think the cooperation agreements might escape the prohibition on anti-competitive agreements in Article 101. I don't intend to go into those today. They are discussed in my papers. I think Martin will be speaking about this. His own analysis is very similar to mine. And there's a convenient summary and a note I did for the OECD before Christmas for those who want a shorter summary of these things and in the longer academic papers. What I will do is, sorry, I'm just flicking on, I will just say a word about one aspect of those. One aspect, one way, is agreements might be exempt from that prohibition if certain conditions are met. One of those conditions is that the agreements, actually, before I could actually say what they're saying, before I mention what the law is, I would again mention that there's a lot of debate over whether or not so-called sustainability agreements can or cannot fall, can be merit an exemption. And I've listened to debates on this, but often there is very little reference to what the law actually says. People immediately start talking about these abstract concepts I was talking about earlier. They don't even start with the law. And this is not an exaggeration. I was at a meeting of the World Economic Forum where this was discussed with top professors, lawyers, economics. Not one person even mentioned the law. And yet we're applying a legal provision. So just to mention one of these provisions, again, I know Martin, I think, will be coming, and others will come back to these. The first condition is that agreements must contribute to improving the production or distribution of goods or to promoting technical or economic progress. Now, an important one there is economic progress. And some people only focus on that. Then they start asking themselves difficult questions like, oh, can a sustainability agreement, can we get non-economic factors like sustainability into economic progress? Can we take this into account? Well, two things there. One, I think if you can produce something more sustainably for the same price or produce a more sustainable version of something, that is economic progress. But leaving that aside, people forget the other three limbs. Improving production. How about agreements to use fewer resources? Improving distribution. How about sharing distribution logistics? Promoting technical progress. How about new green technologies being developed? Again, I discuss this in my papers, but so do others, I would emphasize. I may have given a bibliography of some of my work, but there are excellent papers out there on this by people like Maurits Dolmans, Jordan Ellison, and of course, I've seen Martin's paper. The other area, which is I've just mentioned very briefly, is that consumers must get a fair share. There must be a fair share of the benefits for consumers. Now, this is genuinely a difficult area. There are, I accept, some difficulties here. And I found myself, and this is the main block, I think, for some people in the European Commission in terms of taking this forward. They're trying to overcome this idea of, because they've taken a narrow view recently of a fair share for consumers. I'm not going to go into that now. I think I know Martin may do, I'm not sure. But I would say that the Dutch guidelines go into this. And we have the privilege of Martin Snoep, the head of the Dutch Competition Authority. So I will leave that to him. But there are also some excellent papers out there on this. But I just make one point. Those buying, those producing, although those buying polluting products are causing the problem or contributing to the problem. And for that, shouldn't they bear some of the burden of cleaning that up by having measures to make things less polluting? After all, there's only supposed to be a fair share for consumers. It's not they're supposed to get all the benefits. Anyway, we could talk about that and I have done in other occasions for an hour or so. I'm not going to talk about the other conditions for an exemption. I just want to deal with one or two of the objections that some people have sometimes raised to everything that we say. It seems to me that the legal basis and the policy considerations, the legal basis, that's the constitutional provisions and what the competition provisions actually say, is very clear. And the policy considerations, the need to do everything we can to fight climate change, the fact that the Green Deal is top of the political agenda in Europe and indeed throughout most of the world. These all point towards taking climate change and environmental sustainability, at least, into account in any modern competition policy. But people say, oh yes, well, we understand that, Simon, but it's all too difficult. You don't understand, we'd like to do that, but it's just too difficult, it's too complex in the real world. Well, no, it isn't. My answer to that, every time I have an answer to something, people seem to be trying to find another reason, which I find more and more obscure, to suggest that we can't do something about it. So I'll just make a few points here. I've listed one or two there. But first one I'd make is that we must apply the law. The law is very clear in terms of the imperative to take sustainability into account in all policies. And secondly, shouldn't we focus on what's important in competition law rather than just on what's easy? I've heard commissioners say that in the past. And certainly, I think we have lessons from America. In recent years, I think things may be changing. Many thought that US antitrust law was largely irrelevant because it was focusing on very narrow issues. And we risk irrelevance if we don't step up as a competition community to the number one issue that society, humanity even faces. And when people say it's all too difficult, it's somehow they're suggesting implicitly that the narrow approach focusing on, and I'm exaggerating now, I accept this, and with apologies to the economists, focusing on, say, short-term price effects is easy. Well, no, it isn't. And here I do wear my judge hat. If you've been in a court and you've had 200 pages of econometrics from one party saying black is black, and 200 pages of econometrics from the other side saying that black is white, and you're supposed to work out what the answer is, a narrow econometric quantification type approach is not easy. We do have to take a more holistic view, and balancing different factors is what competition authorities have always done. It's what judges do. And at the risk of making a flippant point, there is a reason why judges are called judges. They are there to make judgments. They're not just to plug in some numbers and come out with an answer. And then, of course, there's the objection that, yes, but we now have a more economic approach. Well, yes, I have some economic background myself, and indeed others who are talking about this have considerably more. I believe Martin Snook has a PhD in economics, and he's 100% on this wavelength. Indeed, I would even go so far as to saying that what myself and others are saying is a more economic approach. If you're talking about trying to factor in externalities into the true price, that is the costs of producing something, which at the moment are dumped on society, like pollution, or if you're trying to factor those into to get the true price, the true cost of a product, that actually requires some pretty sophisticated economics. And there are growing quantitative techniques for doing this. And environmental economics is a growing field. So I've assured my economist colleagues that there's going to be plenty of work for them in the sort of world that I'm talking about. But even then, I do emphasize at the end of the day, it's not just a question of numbers. We have to make value judgments. And I was pleased to see again that the Dutch paper in particular recognizes that it's not always the case that you have to use quantitative techniques. And then finally, there's the so-called slippery slope argument. Yes, Simon, but if we take into climate change, there are 27,000 other objections. I exaggerate only slight objectives in society, or indeed in the European treaties. Somebody that's added them up, and I think they say there are more than 20 objectives. Well, I haven't counted them. But what I would say is two things. One, if you're going to single out any one to particularly focus on, it has to be climate change. And given the existential crisis, and I do not think that is an exaggeration. And secondly, I'm not, and this is before I see Fabian Richter is there, before Fabian says what about other non-environmental sustainability issues, I am equally concerned about, I'm also concerned about those other factors. But all I'm saying is that any difficulties relating to taking into account non-environmental sustainability issues like worker conditions and so forth, any difficulties associated with those should not undermine the priority of taking into account climate change. And each of those other factors should be assessed on their merits, and indeed they do have merits and would often be approved under agreements. And final comment, we do need regulation. We still need regulation. But as I say, it is not always enough. I've set out in my papers a number of proposals for actions. I think some people will be talking about some of those later on. I just mentioned a couple of those. I think we need more positive statements from the authorities. They've heard a lot about what they can't do. They need to hear more about what they can do. The authorities are in the process of updating their guidelines at the moment, and it's a priority for us as a community is to help them with that and provide them with practical examples of the sort of cooperation that needs to go ahead and which is perhaps being inhibited by fears of competition law. Perhaps we need a block exemption. I think Martin's going to talk about that. I'm slightly cautious on that because the trouble is the block exemptions is often the lowest common denominator, because if it's an automatic, everything here is exempt from competition law. It has to be quite rightly drafted in a very conservative manner, and then there's a concern that anything outside that must be illegal, which is not the case. So generally speaking, I don't think we need changes to the law. I have made a few suggestions in my UK paper for changes to the law. For example, climate change and environmental sustainability being seen as a public interest consideration. But I don't want to focus on that because I think we can do most of what we need to do with a proper application of the law as it stands. I think we can learn lessons and should learn lessons from COVID-19. Again, I'm not going into that. I've blogged on it, and there's a discussion in my UK paper on that. If the competition authorities could take effective action in relation to cooperation and show a more pragmatic and a flexible approach for the short term, and I hope I do believe it's a short-term crisis, the COVID crisis, then they should be able to take a more flexible approach. And I think there are signs that they are in relation to the longer term existential crisis of climate change. So I've moved on from saying it's all too difficult to saying, yes, we can. So in conclusion, as I say, we can do much without changing the law. We do need to revisit how we view our law and economics. Sometimes it's nothing new. We're going back to more the approach which we took before we took what I see as something of a wrong turning when we had decentralization of competition law back in the beginning of this century. There are some much better cases from before that change. And just go back and look with a fresh pair of eyes at the law and look at it in the light of the crisis that we face. We as a competition advisors community need to give more robust advice. And here the example that I've given is a non-environmental one, and that's the opinion given to the Fair Wear Foundation, which was an opinion by a law firm showing that providing a living wage to grossly underpaid textile workers in other parts of the world would not infringe competition law. So one, it wouldn't infringe competition law, and two, it's not the sort of thing that the competition authorities were going to challenge. And the sad thing about that case is that the European Commission was consulted privately on it, but wouldn't say anything publicly. And that's one thing that I think needs to change. And I would say, I think is changing. The public authorities, competition authorities, the European Commission are actually saying, bring us examples, and we are more prepared to speak out on them now. So I think there are some genuine difficulties, such as exactly how you interpret a fair share for consumers, but there are ways forward on that. The biggest obstacle is the conservative nature of the competition establishment. But I think things are moving in our direction, but there's a vital role for us all in that competition community to play. So I think I'll end on that note, on a positive note, and a call to people to get involved in this area, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Back to you, Leila.
Thank you so much, Simon, for this, and thank you for this valuable input of, let's just sum up your whole speech into, we do have the tools, we just need to reinterpret them in the situation as it is. So policy coherence requires us to use the law as it is, under these new aims. So thank you for that. That is so rare to hear, because we have all these propositions for a whole revamp for the whole legal system, which is kind of not necessary. Fine-tuning, yes, but revamping the whole thing and imagining it makes it feel so big that nothing is done then. So I really, really appreciate this comment of saying we do have the tools. It's just a matter of reinterpreting it well under the new aims and goals of the EU, for instance, if we're speaking about EU law. So thank you very much for that. It was a great pleasure listening to your speech. So now I would give the floor to our participants, to the listeners, if anybody has a question. So you can raise your hand and ask a question in person, or you can type it in the chat box if you wish to do so. Okay, we have a raised hands. Okay, Professor Sprook, floor is all yours.
All right, so good morning, everyone. Well, Professor Holmes, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation, right? I have a question, right, basically regarding your recent one of your recent remarks, on the obstacles, right, to more sound and inclusive competition law, right? Now, so in your conclusive remarks, you've mentioned the role of basically of what you refer to as conservative economic establishment, right, acting as a barrier, right? Now, but what I think, well, perhaps something to consider, right? Want to know what's your opinion about it, right? I was wondering, what I see as a major obstacle is neither conservative or anti-conservative or liberal economic establishment. What I see as a major obstacle is basically the lack of a sound empirical analysis, right, in the program as a program evaluation tool, right? So to evaluate the effectiveness of competition law, right? For example, speaking of abuses of market power, right, or something, all of these barriers that constrain the adoption of more sustainable business practices. Now, I wonder, so how, right, do you think, in your view, right, so first, do you agree, right, that the lack of sound empirical analysis is a major obstacle? So in a sense that we don't know, right, what is actually the binding constraint on the adoption of more sustainable practices by companies, right? And how do you think that the field of competition law, right, can potentially address this particular void, right, that exists in the field, right? And again, so I would really much like to know what is your stance on it, right? But again, it goes without saying that thank you for a very interesting presentation, which I enjoyed very much.
Thank you. No, a few points. I mean, I'm not quite sure at what point the empirical bit comes in, so I'll mention it in two places. One, you could say, well, what's the empirical basis for thinking there is a problem in the first place? Well, I think a lot of that is not empirical. It is many examples from many major players. But if there was a small study done by the law firm Linklaters, and 60% of the respondents said that they had refrained from sustainability, cooperating with competitors on sustainability initiatives for fear of competition law. So I don't think there's a vast amount of so-called empirical work there, but I have absolutely no doubt that it's real from my own experience and the experience of other people I talked to. But in terms of narrow studies and so on, that's the only one I particularly know of. So if I could just assume that there is a problem, then the question is, when we're trying to apply competition law or provide seek an exemption, we're trying to weigh up, see what the benefits are of a particular agreement and so forth. There, I think we have a lot of empirical tools. And as I say, I'm not an expert, but I have seen there are lots of ways, for example, of measuring carbon price, and there are some worked examples in many of the papers. Very simple example has been provided by Jordan Ellison in his carbon defense paper, and there is more work coming out there. Oxera, I know, is about to publish a paper. I don't think it's come out yet, but they're about to publish a paper that from which is a leading firm of economists who specialize in competition economics, are looking at it from an economic perspective. There is a vast amount of stuff out there on valuing carbon, a ton of carbon. So you can start to see how you can do things. You can start to calculate, well, this agreement is going to result in a reduction of X tons of carbon. Carbon is valued at $50 or $100 or whatever it may be, and so forth. So you can see how you can start to work out the benefits and so forth. But the comment I would make is that much as I respect economists and I'm fascinated by the area myself, I think we've become over obsessed with quantifying things. Not everything in life needs to be quantified. I sometimes refer to Oscar Wilde when his definition of a cynic was that the person who knew the price of everything but the value of nothing. And if I want to be unkind, I sometimes feel that that's the approach of some economists. You have to look at values and make judgments. And I was pleased to say there's nothing new. I was looking again, if I can just find it. The European, there's some examples in the Dutch paper about how where you don't need to quantify things. And I was interested to see, because I'd forgotten about it, the European Commission itself, back in 2004, in its guidelines on exemption agreements, has this statement. There may be this may be where an agreement allows 2 tyre manufacturers to bring to market 3 years earlier a new substantially safer tyre, but at the same time, by increasing their market power, allows them to raise prices by 5%. In such a case, it is likely that having early access to a substantially improved product outweighs the price increase. So the important thing is there that the Commission is expressing a judgment there. What they're not trying to do is to work out what the economic dollar value is of a substantially safer tyre. They're accepting that it's substantially safer is going to save lives, potentially thousands or even thousands of them. That outweighs a 5% price increase. So you didn't need to do that on an empirical basis. Not everything needs to be done on an empirical basis. We can go too far in that direction, I think.
I think this is the classical battle, lawyers versus economists, right?
Yeah, and I'm desperately trying to get that's what I'm trying to avoid. I'm trying to get more economists on board.
I know, Simon, but I think it's really like the 2 value systems, because I kind of have them inherited too, because I'm both. So I know the fight inside of me, so I understand. But I think Rock was expecting an answer like that too, because I think he stumbles upon it every single time when he stumbles upon sustainability, right? so here we are. Just a very brief comment, please, from Professor Takis, because we need to continue with the program and with Kaplana because she's very, very busy. So here you go. The floor is all yours, Professor.
I just responded to the invitation. One of the biggest problems when you make and you take decisions based on values is whose values? And that's the main problem, mine or yours. With quantitative part, it's somehow further down the road. Just a comment.
Yeah, I accept, and we appoint commission officials to have those values, to apply the values. Those values, I think, they update those values in the light of society's values. If you read papers like that of Professor Ezeraki, on the sponge theory about how we absorb the values of the wider society, we have to entrust them to do it. And then there are appeals to courts, and then there are appeals from the first instance courts. So we have a system in place, but the only other point I was making is don't be fooled into thinking that something that involves numbers is value free, because numbers can be used to point in very different directions. So it's not sort of numbers black and white, values all vague. It's simply not the way it is.
Thanks. Okay. I'll wait for my presentation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you once again, Simon, for the great presentation and for the comments. Are the participants allowed to contact you if they have any additional questions? Because I think your expertise is priceless. So please contact also Simon in the contacts provided. If you have any additional questions, I'm sure he's going to be able to share very valuable insights. Thank you very much.
On that note, Leila, I would mention that I mentioned the a few examples that were annexed to my slides. There is also a bibliography there for people who are interested in some of the things that I've discussed in more detail.
Exactly. I already shared the document publicly, so I put it online. I shared it with the participants, and I will share it also with the ones who kind of missed out the session, despite the fact that they were applied. So thank you very much, Simon.